couple of weeks ago, I was in Edmonton shooting some interviews with folks who are in the hydrogen economy. And I have to say, a lot has changed in the last year or so. Everybody's really excited. There are projects underway. There's capital flowing into those projects. And now the Hydrogen Center of Excellence has awarded $20 million to 18 projects for a variety of work, many of them centered around hydrogen technology. And I'm going to talk to Bryan Helfenbaum, who is the Executive Director of Advanced Hydrocarbons in the Clean Energy Division of Alberta Innovates. So welcome to the interview, Bryan.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, I have to say, I was impressed by the level of excitement and enthusiasm in Edmonton. I interviewed mayors, I interviewed companies that are in that space, some of the government folk who are administering programs. And it seems like the hydrogen economy in Alberta has taken a leap forward in the last 12 to 18 months. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, in some ways, the hydrogen economy has been here for a lot longer than people realize. Alberta is Canada's largest producer and consumer of hydrogen, but it's been at an industrial level. And so it's been, I'd say, mostly invisible to the general public. A lot of the recent work is starting to expand that concept of the hydrogen economy into more applications that people see and use every day. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of excitement in that space right now. And that's not just in Edmonton, in Alberta, in Canada, but globally as well.
Right. And two of those applications would be buses. So the city of Edmonton and the county of Strathcona are getting, I think they each have a hydrogen bus that they'll be using as a pilot project. Plus the Alberta Motor Trucking Association launched a long haul trucking project between Calgary and Edmonton with two hydrogen Class 8 semi-trucks. So it looks, we're kind of getting into the pilot project, demonstration project phase of technology adoption here. And how much of that is part of the $20 million award? How much are how many projects have we got that are in that space?
So we've got a few projects in that space, and I need to clarify that the Hydrogen Center of Excellence is similar but different to what you're seeing in Edmonton right now. So indeed, there is a lot of, I'll call it commercial level activity happening in Edmonton, both in terms of announcements for new hydrogen production, as well as these pilot projects for new demand, particularly in mobility. In addition to the examples you cited, CP Rail is building their third hydrogen powered locomotive. So there's a lot going on for new demand as well. The Hydrogen Center of Excellence, though, is really geared towards the earlier stage technology development. So we look at those technologies that are being deployed in Edmonton, and we are huge fans of it, and we are supporting it through the center. But the majority of the funding from the center is really looking to develop the Generation 2 and Generation 3 technologies to expand those opportunities and to reduce the costs further. So while we touch on the complete value chain of production, distribution, storage, and end use, we're not directly funding, those larger scale projects that are underway. We're really funding lower technology readiness level opportunities in the so-called valley of death of technology development.
Right, and for viewers who aren't familiar with that, very often what happens is that technologies come out of a lab, they come out of a university research, maybe commercial research, and then they go into a demonstration project. Does this a very small scale, does this technology work outside of the lab? Then after that, they go to a pilot project. So that gets scaled up a little bit more and to see if it does it scale? Will it operate at a higher level of production? And then it goes into commercial production. But it's in that out of the lab and between commercial production that very often private capital dries up. And so public capital steps in to de-risk the technology, bring down the costs, improve its efficiency, so on and so forth. That's where we're at, right?
That's right. Right. As we get into prototyping and small scale piloting, it's a bit early for a lot of venture capital or industry capital, but it's getting too expensive for universities and research labs, and so public capital is here to help. Now, we just help. We're not solely funding, so we're putting in $20 million into these projects, and industry and partners are putting in $180 million. So really great leverage for the public dollars that are going in.
Is this part of a deliberate strategy on the part of Alberta Innovates? I mean, the reason I ask, Bryan, is because I've been doing some reading in Mariana Mazzucato, who the American economist who writes a lot about this, and then of course we have the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which is very much about subsidize, public capital coming in, leveraging private capital, de-risking clean energy technologies and scaling them up so that you have a hydrogen economy or an EV economy or a battery economy or whatever it is. So are you working in that sort of intellectual space when you're putting these, when Alberta Innovates is thinking, putting together its strategy for this?
Absolutely. There is a global race right now for hydrogen development. The very poorly named Inflation Reduction Act out of the US is extremely lucrative, and we're very much in competition with some of those activities. And so we're trying to attract capital and activity, and really help enable some of these opportunities to develop within Alberta. Alberta is extremely well positioned. As I mentioned, we're already the nation's leader in production and consumption. We have the pore space for sequestering CO2 as part of hydrogen production, um, using methane. Um, Steam methane reforming. We have a lot of the expertise, the facilities. So we're really trying to go from a position of strength to become a global leader.
Yeah, I think that's a point that needs to be made is that the hydrogen economy, when we're talking about hydrogen for uh, mobility to start, but large industrial operations, heat where you need heat, that where it's currently provided by natural gas or coal, those kinds of operations. I mean, that's fairly nascent. I mean, this we're at the beginning here, and it looks like Alberta has a quite a competitive advantage. So have we got, that Edmonton Regional Hydrogen Hub, is that becoming like an industrial cluster where you have a number of these companies that are scaling up and the supply chains to support them?
Absolutely. And that's really the model that we've seen work in the Netherlands and across Europe, is starting with hubs, right? Build a hub, build another hub, and start to connect them together. And so Edmonton is really Canada's first significant hydrogen hub. And so building out that industrial complex lends the infrastructure that you can develop all these different end uses. And so you talked about mobility, right? And that's one of the lower lying fruit for hydrogen deployment, to power trucks, trains, ships. Uh, but there's other opportunities as well with for heat, for power generation. Now the economics on these vary, and so they'll develop at different periods of time. But as you build out that infrastructure, you really enable all these other end uses to develop.
Is there a sense within Alberta Innovates that you're experimenting with what works and what doesn't? Because I've interviewed a number of critics of hydrogen who are very skeptical that hydrogen will work except in a few very, limited kind of applications. And so is that, do you have that in mind that, some of this stuff just isn't going to turn out to be commercially viable?
Absolutely. And that's really why we exist, right? Is to test these ideas in a controlled setting before, immense capital is deployed into them. And the concerns are legitimate, right? And we don't really know, and macroeconomics continue to shift. Hydrogen's a very small molecule and is prone to leaking. And we don't have a lot of experience in a lot of the things that we're talking about. We're talking about hydrogen as an energy carrier. It's not an energy source. So we have to make the hydrogen. We have to make sure that when we look at the full value chain, that we're still coming out ahead, in terms of energy efficiency and carbon reduction. And so there's a lot of legitimate concerns. One example, yesterday we had the public announcement, and one of the highlighted projects was a pure hydrogen community in the Edmonton area, which is a great idea, maybe, right? And we're not actually building out that community right now, but this is a study to determine the feasibility of whether it can work and really whether it makes sense. And so I think, the critics are certainly justified in having concerns. Whether it's blending hydrogen into existing lines, whether it's storage, all of these ideas need to be fully de-risked to ensure that they're safe, to ensure that we actually are going to achieve the decarbonization that we think we're going to, and make sure we're not just drinking our own Kool-Aid.
Right. And once those technologies get tested and some of this intellectual property becomes viable, is that something that Alberta Innovates and the industry can leverage to be a significant competitive advantage against other jurisdictions that are also trying to build a hydrogen economy?
Yeah, that's our hope. Certainly everything that we invest public dollars into, we have publicly available reports. And so we ensure that, the companies that are receiving the funding are hopefully successful in their endeavors, but we want to make sure that they're not the only ones who are successful, and that knowledge is disseminated to others to build out this opportunity for the good of the people of Alberta and ultimately Canada.
Bryan, can you give us a couple of examples from the 18 projects that are being funded? Just a couple of representative ones that listeners might be interested in.
Sure. So on the production front, projects in methane pyrolysis. So right now, you know, there are two primary ways to make hydrogen, either splitting water through a process called electrolysis into hydrogen, which is quite energy intensive, but can be decarbonized by using low carbon sources of electricity, and then steam methane reforming, which is near and dear to our hearts because of the large amounts of natural gas we have, with added carbon capture and sequestration for the CO2. Methane pyrolysis, rather than generating carbon dioxide, that carbon is coming out as a solid product, typically something like a carbon black. And so it basically eliminates the complexity and cost of having to do something with that carbon dioxide, namely to sequester it. And so that's an exciting opportunity that's getting a lot of attention worldwide, and we've got projects in the 18 that apply there. And then looking at different hydrogen burner testing. So if we're going to convert old coal plants into hydrogen plants for power generation, how do we actually do that, right? And what equipment needs to go into it? And then dual fuel trucking is another area of interest. And so to help with the adoption, it's very challenging for consumers to go directly to a pure hydrogen fueled vehicle, given there's a lack of distribution and filling stations right now. So these hybrid dual fuel opportunities are quite compelling because it allows for that adoption. And so these are just a few examples. We have other projects in the storage area and in the distribution area, looking at liners and pipelines, so we can use our existing network, et cetera. So pretty exciting projects.
Well, Bryan, we'll come back to you in 6 to 12 months, get an update on where some of these projects are. And thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.